NHS strikes, VAT on private healthcare, the Online Safety Act, Trump tariffs and Epstein, Gaza and Palestine. I'm back, Frank McKenna, with the Downtown Den Politics Podcast.
The return of the sausages.
All sorts of things that I would have wanted as a kid that I couldn't have, right? Famously, Sky TV.
How'd that happen? I guess I just forgot what was going on.
They're eating the dogs, the people that came in. They're eating the cats.
Hey, it worked.
So welcome back to the Downtown Den Politics, and I am back. Yes, Frank McKenna is in the building, and I'm absolutely delighted to be joined as ever by my old muckers, Jim Hancock and Joe Phillips. I've obviously spent a couple of weeks in the sun in the wonderful Skiathos, and I have to say, what a fabulous Greek island that is. Wonderful food, sun, sea, and plenty of the other S as well. Sangria, James, sangria. Anyway.
Suntan lotion, sand, salt.
Moving swiftly on, as I
Fell
say.
into that one, didn't I?
You absolutely did. Your face betrayed you, James. Listen, I draw the line and you rub it out, sir. That's the rule, isn't it? So, as I say, we're going to discuss NHS strikes, Online Safety Acts, Donald Trump, as ever, of course, in the news, and Gaza and the recognition of a Palestinian state, or potentially the recognition from the UK government and many others around the world as well. Let's start, though, with that domestic story. The big one this week, I guess, is the NHS and those strikes, which, according to government statistics, have not damaged the health service as much as past disputes have. And indeed, they are reporting that as many as 93% of operations that were due to take place were successfully completed, and therefore the dent in waiting lists and those other things that the government concerns itself with not being as damaging as perhaps may have been the case. Now, we've discussed this a few weeks ago when the doctors decided to strike, and we all agreed that we felt that in light of the fact that they got a 29% pay increase just about a year ago, it was somewhat unfortunate of a decision. Seems to me perhaps the militant leadership is not necessarily backed by the groundswell of doctors that obviously been turning up for work during that 5-day dispute, Joe. So where do you think this leaves the union, the BMA, and where does it leave Wes Streeting? Is the health secretary in a stronger position in light of those statistics?
Yes, I think he is. And I think also the very, very robust response from National Health Service managers who, they put contingency plans in place. They said they were going to sort of carry on as much as they could. And as you say, according to statistics, over 90% of normal procedures and surgery and operations went ahead. So I think it's had limited impact. We know there is very, very much weaker public support for the doctors. And I think it'll be interesting to see whether there are moves within the BMA to try and sort of change the leadership or to go back to the table. I mean, it's good for Wes Streeting because it means he's in a position to say, look, you had a pay rise. I've said I'll talk to you about other things like training, pensions, working practices, etc., etc. Come and talk to me. I mean, I'm sure there are people around the country who have had an impact on operations or outpatients appointments and things like that. And there will be a different story depending where you are, but it certainly seems to have had less of an impact. The problem, I think, and the challenge is whether the BMA leadership think, oh, we've got to make a much bigger impact. But I don't get the impression, and it may be because it's summertime and a lot of people are on holiday, but I don't get the impression that there is the huge support amongst members of the BMA to go down that route of more militant action.
And I think the other thing that you've got to give Wes Streeting credit for in terms of the thing we've criticised the government generally speaking, about is the narrative. You know, he's created a story that I think has been compelling in terms of being able to say to the wider public, but also obviously speaking directly to those NHS workers, well, these are the facts. You know, the 29% pay increase aside, you do have long-term security in terms of your employment. And of course, there is a clear career progression path. And I think it was Wes, or certainly one of the ministers from the health team, who was making the point that this comparator of, well, a junior doctor or a resident doctor, as they're called now, earns the same as somebody who's serving in McDonald's. Well, yeah, of course they do for the first year, but then it quickly accelerates. Yeah. And of course, if you're working on minimum wage in McDonald's in 2025, then you're still going to be earning minimum wage in McDonald's in 2035. Whereas if you're a resident doctor, then in 10 years' time, your salary is going to be six figures. So I thought that the storytelling on this particular issue has been good. And I'm not surprised that Wes Streeting has been leading it, because he continues to be by far the best communicator the government has got, Jim.
Yes, and he, without, I'm sure, intending it, is enhancing his position way out in front as the candidate for the leadership of the Labour Party from what's sort of roughly called the blue Labour side. You know, that is sort of, with a heart, but with a toughness to deal with these issues, whether it be benefits or that. Now, you'll say to me, of course, that there is no vacancy, but I heard a lovely phrase the other day about the Labour Party. There may not be a vacancy, but there's always a leadership race.
Very good.
But getting back to the subject, getting back to the subject in hand, I mean, I think it's very significant that we haven't heard new strikes being called. So, as Joe has alluded to, there's obviously some thinking going on amongst the leadership of the BMA as to whether they're going to call a fresh round of strikes. But my feeling is, that it tends to be the case that the maximum support for industrial action tends to come at the beginning of a dispute, and then it sort of weakens. So I don't think the BMA can think, as Joe suggested, if they ratchet up, that they'll get more support. So I think they're at maximum pressure at the moment. I mean, obviously my caveats are, can the NHS management keep it up? I mean, I imagine they've had to do quite a lot of jigging and poking to make sure all these operations up to, I think you said 94%, Frank, have been done. Whether they can keep that up week on week, and of course it is summertime. The pressures will come in the autumn if it's not resolved. And of course we have got other sections of the NHS, the nurses in particular, who are about to ballot, I think, on industrial action. So Wes Streeting's problems haven't gone away. He's handling it very well in the court of public opinion. But I mean, just to put the case for the doctors and the nurses, they do feel that there are, it's a pretty high pressured lifestyle. They don't appear to be prepared to negotiate on those things, even though Streeting's putting that out there. But they obviously have a pay legacy issue going back to 2008, but haven't we all? And so that's the position as I see it. That Streeting's enhanced his position. The BMA have got to rethink this, and there's got to be an off ramp. They've got to get round the negotiating table, negotiate perhaps on the conditions, and that may be the way of resolving it.
Yeah, as I say, I think that the BMA perhaps have misread the room in terms of the court of public opinion. Certainly, I don't think that there's anywhere near the sort of backing that they got a couple of years ago now, isn't it, when they first went on strike. But of course, the whole issue again of NHS funding comes up, and we need more money for the National Health Service. When is so much money going to be enough money? I mean, it just seems to me to be a black hole almost. If you're not going to reform the NHS, introduce AI, start to get more efficiencies into the service, then we are always going to be in this vicious circle of having to throw more money at it. And of course, wages take a big chunk of that cash, don't they? And Neil Kinnock's solution to this, he's decided to express this view over the weekend. I'm sure Keir Starmer's delighted with Neil Kinnock's continued contribution to the discussions of the economy, is to put VAT on private healthcare. Now, this sort of ties in with previous statements that Kinnock has made about introducing a wealth tax. And I just caution the guy that I did support back in the 80s for the leadership of the Labour Party. I'm beginning to understand why he didn't become Prime Minister, to be honest. That all of the evidence from across the globe suggests that wealth taxes simply don't work, because as we know, and as we've said on this podcast previously, if you've got that sort of coin, then you will move your money, or you will find ways of avoiding, in a legal way, the tax that the government are demanding of you. And the Treasury will also tell you that there is a pinch point for taxation, and we're probably at that now, to be fair. And so this idea of wealth taxes and VAT on this and VAT on the other, solving the economic challenges that the Chancellor has, a bit pie in the sky, really. So I do wonder, Jim, two issues here, really. Firstly, we are only a couple of months away from the Chancellor's next budget, so she will be thinking about how she can close this financial gap that she has. But secondly, when we talk about the big spending department, which the NHS is, how quickly do you think that Streeting and the government can move to start getting a more productive NHS that will lead to less resource, less cash being eaten into?
Well, I think, AI, I mean, I don't fully understand it, but I'm being forced to learn about it day by day, because you sort of feel it seeping into your life whenever you go on the computer now. That AI will help with bringing down costs in a couple of ways. One is in the administration. I mean, that you remember years ago they tried to have a consolidated record of everybody's health, and the NHS computers just couldn't handle it. Well, I imagine with this increased power that AI will have, that the administrative side of the NHS, all that massive millions of appointments being made, some being cancelled, all that sort of stuff, and very importantly, our health records, so that anyone who has contact with us can, at a flick of a press of a button, find out what the medical history of us is. Mm-hmm. That will be a saving. And the more dramatic thing from my point of view is robotics in operations. It's already begun, and if these robots can do it, I mean, I honestly wouldn't fancy it if I went into an operating theatre and there's no surgeon. There was just, hello, I'm going to operate on you. I wouldn't like it very much. So,
Alexa, take me kidney out, please.
Ooh, you look far too overweight for me to operate on. Not worth doing. Next one, please.
Yeah, I am aware of the fact that robotics are already in place, and of course the success rate of robotic operations is 100%, because these things very seldom make mistakes, and you are not subject to a doctor coming in who's been on a 16-hour shift, perhaps a bit fatigued, making those errors, I understand where you're coming from, Jim, but I think it's perhaps a little bit traditional in terms of that approach. And you do wonder where it's all going to go. But coming back to Kinnock and his banging on about wealth taxes and VAT on this, and targeting people who've got a few bob, I have to declare an interest here. After the first 5 years of the Conservative government, 2010 to 15, was coalition government, but austerity has hit hard. I've got, a few kids, obviously myself and Vic, and we've got private health insurance because the NHS, in my view, isn't fit for purpose. I haven't seen a GP for 20 years. I don't even bother trying to get an appointment. I got time to sit on the phone at 8 o'clock in the morning. So what do? I end up paying a few bob and going to a private clinic around the corner to get a regular checkup and make sure I'm okay. But unless and until we get a national health service that is up and running, then I think there'll be an awful lot of people who are considered middle class who are a bit pissed off at that suggestion.
Yeah,
Sorry.
I think you're right, Frank, and I think it's it's ever so easy because our hearts emotionally you think tax the rich, that's going to make everything better. But the reality is that's a very good example, and I know many people who have paid for hip replacements or knee replacements or single episodes because they've been to their GP, they've been told it'll be 6 months before they see a consultant, they can't walk, and meantime they go, all right, well, I'll eat into my savings, I'll pay for this. And actually, you can argue that takes the pressure off the NHS, but of course it's the same doctors who are doing the operation. I mean, the ludicrous thing, and I'm sorry, I'm not going to be able to forget Jim pretending to be a robot. I quite like it, sort of friendly Uncle Jim robot with an Alexa voice. But, the breakthroughs in technology on things like keyhole surgery, for instance, and scanning, which have made it so much easier for people. They can go in, they can be home in a couple of hours, or certainly after an overnight stay. You can have procedures and investigations now that once upon a time would have required you being in hospital. But it seems utterly bonkers that you've got all this technology for the front end, if you like, of doing the stuff, but you're still sending out letters by post 3.5 days after the appointment was cancelled. And it's that needs to be shaken up, and whoever decides to do it, because we all remember Tony Blair trying to revolutionize the health service, which is an unbelievably expensive white elephant of a technology system that didn't work. Somebody really needs to get a grip on this, and people need to say, show me how it works. Oh, that doesn't work. Not people sitting around saying, oh, that's marvelous, to some fat bloke who normally sits at home eating pizzas, playing games, who comes in and says it'll go da 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 da. That's how it works. It's easy, because what you end up with is Fujitsu and the post office.
Frank, a question to you: are you content to continue to pay your taxes to contribute to the NHS whilst also paying your private fees? I mean, I raise that issue because I just wonder whether the consensus on paying this huge bill for the NHS will begin to diminish the more people take private medicine. It's a bit like the argument over the BBC licence fee. If less people are watching the BBC, why should they pay a fee? So I don't know what your feelings are about. Well, I think I know what you're going to say, but I mean, do you think there is a trend that it might undermine the consent to pay this money for the NHS?
I hope I speak for the vast majority of people who are in private health schemes that no, absolutely no problem at all in continuing to pay towards the NHS. And as I say, if we got to a situation where we had under the last Labour government, where the NHS significantly improved, waiting lists were a reasonable timescale, you could get an appointment with your GP, and it was just more effective and efficient service, then I'd be delighted to stop paying my fees to Bupa. I'd much prefer that than argue that I shouldn't be paying tax and contributing to the wider health of the nation, which impacts on us all anyway. So, no, absolutely, Jim. I've no problem with that. But I do think that I would object to a VAT charge being put onto private health insurance on the basis that I would be saying to Mr. Kinnock, well, sort the NHS out first, pal, and actually, how much money do you want to go into the health service? This is the problem, isn't it? It's just this black hole that we seem to be spending loads of cash on. If I may make this point, the more that we continue to simply throw money at the NHS, the more that doctors and nurses say, well, we're going to go on strike because we think we deserve double-digit pay increases because of the legacy effect of lack of pay rises in the past, the more likely it is that the argument that Nigel Farage is making, which is that we should move to at least a 50% insurance system, and that would eventually lead to 75%, you would end up with a Cinderella service, being the NHS. You are adding fuel to the flames of people who say we can't afford a universal health service anymore.
This is the test for Streeting, whether he can get those productivity deals. Because it's all, you know, it's all right to talk tough about the doctors, and we've said he's enhanced his reputation with that. But in a little while, we're going to be asking for the evidence that in return for these pay increases, Streeting is getting the productivity things, which is the other part of the Blue Labour deal. You know, we support the NHS, but we expect it to work efficiently, and bearing down on the unions in that respect. That's going to be a real test for West Streeting.
Never forget the BMA were very much opposed to a national health service.
They were indeed, as I have said on many occasions and reminded people that these very same people who are putting the NHS at risk are the same people, or the progeny, if you like, of the BMA who fought so hard to keep the NHS not happening. I just want to go back though, Frank, on your VAT thing. Do you feel the same about schools, about private schools?
No, because I think you've got options.
Yeah.
And as much as education is hugely important, of course it is, not a matter of life and death.
Yeah.
So, you know, if as I had this situation, again, declare an interest here. My daughter went to a school in the city that wasn't appropriate for her. And so we ended up sending her off to a private school. And if VAT would have been on the fees at that point, I'd have happily paid it, because that was my personal choice.
Yeah.
You have the option, don't you? But I don't have an option of sitting on a phone every morning in the hope that I'm going to get a GP appointment. I don't have an option, if something did go, God forbid, anything wrong with one of the kids, of sitting and waiting 2-3 years for the operation so that they can start to live a normal life again. So I think there is a place for VAT. In fact, I think I argued a few weeks ago that I wouldn't massively object to a blanket VAT increase, as long as it was targeted and we could protect as best as we can those people who are already suffering from the cost of living crisis. But I think this idea of going after the wealthy all the time, which certain people within the Labour Party now seem to have latched onto. I heard Annalise Dodds making a similar case on a recent podcast, and I like Annalise. Kinnock's done it a couple of times now. It's gesture politics to me. As I say, it doesn't make economic sense, because the Treasury never raises the sort of cash that it needs to raise. And the people you always end up hitting when these sort of tax rises are so-called targeted on the wealthy is the middle class. And if you want to lose the next election, well, you carry on talking out. And it sounds a bit to me, Jim, I don't know what you think about this, sounds a bit like the old sort of class warfare stuff. And it's a language that doesn't really resonate with many people these days.
No, I mean, to be generous to Neil Kinnock, perhaps he is trying to look around for what Rachel's going to do, because this is going to be the big conversation in the run up to the budget. Where is she going to find the money for this new black hole that's been created by the pullback on welfare benefits and so on? So, let's allow Kinnock that possibility. I mean, Joe and I think have raised with you before, our desire to see a bigger tax on gambling and a tax on the social media companies. Now, I think you've sort of said that the sums don't add up, that it won't make all that much difference. But you've now raised the very interesting issue of a general increase in VAT. So do you think that Rachel Reeves would take the risk? I mean, I'm not against it. I just want for us to discuss this. She gets up, we have a new black hole. We have this massive increase in defence expenditure, which we couldn't have anticipated, blah, blah, blah. My colleagues have decided to take steps on welfare reform, which have financial consequences. Therefore, with regret, and I hope that it will not be a long-term thing, we are going to increase the rate of VAT. Now, would she take that risk?
I don't think she will, but I think she should. I was with, just before I went on holiday, lots of Labour MPs. Great to bump into Wes and had a good chat with him, and was in a room of about 100 people where Keir Starmer was talking about his first year as Prime Minister and going through a whole host of things, by the way, the government have delivered, and made the point that, you know, we do 96 things right and 4 things wrong, and everybody focuses on the 4 things. Well, welcome to government, Keir, in one sense, as far as that's concerned, but equally, those 4 fucking things were quite big. So, you know, it was good to get into the room and start to have some of those conversations. And there is, I don't want to overstate this, but there is definitely a split in terms of thinking within probably the cabinet and certainly the party. So you've got this gang who think that you can just go and tax the rich and that'll raise all the money that you need for the services that are required. And then you've got the other wing of the party. I don't want to be putting words in Wes's mouth here. He didn't say this, but I would guess he'd be on this side of the argument, who are saying we've got to get more efficiencies, we've got to improve productivity, but we've inherited something that is far worse than we anticipated. And you've also really want to get into this discussion today, but you've got an awful lot of inexperienced MPs on those Labour backbenchers. And I've spent quite a bit of time with a few of them, and they were wringing their hands over getting 10 emails on an issue. You know, now this goes back to the selection process that was put in place by Morgan McSweeney, supported by Keir Starmer, where you've got these people who have never been involved in political campaigning before, often, have never really had that sort of rough and tumble of the political debate. And they come into Parliament, and as I say, they get 10 emails about, you know, the welfare debate being one of them. Was talking to one MP, and he said, oh, well, 1 in 5 of the people in my constituency are on PIP. I said, yeah, mate, that's fine. I said, but 4 in 5 aren't, and they're pissed off. They might not be emailing you, but they are pissed off. So it's that lack of experience. It's that, we've said on here before, lack of a clear plan and strategy that has boxed this government in. And unless and until Rachel does bite the bullet and go radical on something, I fear that from year to year, we're just going to be in this spiral of, oh, what's she going to do next? How much money is she going to be short next year? How are the markets going to react? So I hope she bites the bullet, but I've got no expectation that she will. One final point on this, if I may, because I was watching something a couple of weeks ago now about the 90s. Do you remember those days, eh? Bloody hell, Jim was only 68, 78 back in the 90s. And it was, there was a piece on Clinton, and Clinton's the first thing that Clinton did, the first thing that Rachel Reeves or Keir Starmer should have done after the election this time. He put a chart up, and in those days it was a cardboard chart on the telly, presidential address, and he said, this is the problem we've got in the States. Look at the deficit. And it was trillions of dollars. Yeah. He said, now to get that down to here, what I've got to do is I've got to increase taxes and I've got to cut services. I don't want to do it, but if the country is going to survive, that's the way we've got to play this, because what we've inherited here is a far bigger mess than I thought we had. And he spoke, using Joe's phrase, he spoke human, he spoke the truth, and people backed him. He got 2 presidential elections, he got the economy back on track, he got the deficit down, and the rest is history. I think that within weeks of taking office, Rachel Reeves or Keir Starmer should have made that address to the people of the UK. Is it still possible to do that now, Joe, or is it too late?
Well, not unless she does a crash course in speaking human, because I don't think anyone's listening to her. And I think, you know, the problem is they've made such terrible missteps, as we've discussed, you know, ad nauseum, but winter fuel, farmers. I mean, on a tiny little thing, I got an email from a friend of mine yesterday saying that Angela Rayner has given councils the authority now to sell off allotments if they need to raise money. Well, allotments are actually protected. Now, you know, what puts me and John Curtis, the election guru, in the same boat? We've both got allotments, along with Jeremy Corbyn, as we know. But that's the sort of thing, if you're scrabbling around and you're really, really going to piss off people who've got allotments so that councils can save a few quid, that is not going to work. You've got to do something big and bold, and it might be VAT. I mean, there would be a howling and a wailing, but you know, all the time you see another £100 million going into not having any impact on stopping the boats coming across the channel, or you see more money going into the health service, or you see, you know, money for this, that and the other, and you've got everybody else pleading poverty. The problem is, as we know, they've inherited such a terrible mess, but they haven't articulated it, and they're being allowed, or they're allowing themselves to be blown off course by immigration, for instance, which is the hot topic of the moment, which obscures the other thing, that if everybody had got a decent house, access to a doctor, a good school for their kids, and they weren't, you know, risking their car suspension every time they drove down a road full of potholes, then people wouldn't feel so cross. But because they are not feeling any benefit, I mean, she's either got to do something that people can say, oh, that's brilliant, or they're going to have that Clinton conversation. But I think that moment's past, Frank.
My view on this is that whatever she does at the budget, she's going to get stick from the usual suspects. And so do something big and bold, roll the dice. Because I do think, as again Jim wrote a few weeks ago, they basically got a year to get this right. And if that budget doesn't hit the spot, then it's going to be really, really tough for them to turn the ship around, Jim. Yes,
just on the presentation point, I mean, they did immediately start talking about the £22 billion black hole that they'd been left. That is true. But of course, they didn't go on to the second thing that Clinton did. Clinton described the problem, but then said what he was going to do about it. And that's what we lacked. They were either afraid or, as there seems to be increasing evidence, though I find it incredible, were not prepared for government in a broader sense. But I now think that to go back over that 22 billion is getting tired. Political messages have a shelf life, and I don't think they can do that. I think they can more credibly say, since we came into office, the big thing that changed was when Trump came in and told NATO to start looking after itself. And the defense implications of that are huge. And move on to some of the agenda that's happened since they took office that's made it that put them in this difficult position, rather than going back over the rhetoric about the 22 billion.
Yeah, it's a good point. Well, listen, we'll have to move on because we've spent a good 30 minutes on that particular subject. The NHS has taken into all sorts of areas, but of course, it is in the end all about the cash, isn't it? The economy's stupid. But the other big debate that has been raging this week is whether Nigel Farage is a Jimmy Savile fan. Peter Kyle, I think, misspoke, if he was to be honest, when talking about the Online Safety Act. And he got himself into a little bit of a tangle whereby he ended up saying that people who oppose the Online Safety Act, which I will tell you is legislation that was first thought of and introduced by which Prime Minister? Theresa May. Fucking hell. We wonder why things don't happen quickly in this country. This piece of legislation, yes, introduced by Theresa May initially, is opposed by people, not just Nigel Farage, lots of people, because they are concerned that this is an attack on freedom of speech and all the usual things that you get. I think also, just in terms of people not wanting to spend endless minutes, because we know what people are like these days, in terms of clicking the right buttons in order to get onto particular websites. But I think that was a cack-handed attack, Joe, on Nigel Farage, and actually gave the Reform leader the platform and the opportunity he needed to push back and to move the story away from what this really should be about, which is children's safety.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I'm really surprised, because I think Peter Kyle is normally very sure-footed. He's he's eloquent, he's articulate, he's a safe pair of hands, but he's actually very engaging. So I think it was a terrible, terrible mistake. And of course, as you say, it's allowed Nigel Farage to take the centre stage on this and to turn it into something about free speech. But more damagingly, to keep repeating the false allegations that Keir Starmer as DPP failed to investigate Jimmy Savile. And we've now seen Jess Phillips writing an article in one of the newspapers this morning, basically doubling down on what Peter Kyle said, that anyone who opposes the online safety bill is supporting paedophiles, which is absolutely bonkers. And it's a ridiculous argument because, as you've just said, Frank, this was legislation introduced by Theresa May back in those days long ago, 80,000 prime ministers ago. All those ministerial careers disappeared. And I think the problem is, and has always been, is that governments move too slowly to cope with technological advances. And most people in government don't understand technology, as we've just discussed about IT. That's why they've allowed, people to pull the wool over their eyes on frightfully expensive, non-working IT systems. So you can't beat the technology with legislation. It's a sledgehammer that might just about catch a nut. And I think what's happened, and it's the law of unintended consequences, is that you've got lots of little hobby groups or small businesses who are hugely impacted by this. I was reading something the other day, a hamster appreciation society or a hamster, pet owners club or something. They're having huge problems because they can't do it. So the big companies can deal with it. They can either find a way around it or they can comply. The people who want to, and that probably includes most 12-year-olds, can find a way to get a VPN so that they are invisible. And so actually what they've got is law that is not fit for purpose because it's completely out of sync with technology. But I think the government needs to tone down this stuff because this is just fuel to the fire. It's absolute, meat and drink to reform and Robert Jenrick and those people. Because if you say anyone who opposes this supports Jimmy Savile, it's a bit like saying anyone who hates the idea of a hotel full of single asylum seekers in their small town where all the shops are boarded up is a right-wing lunatic. You're just going to make people angry. And they're just going to say, you're not listening again.
I think it comes back to the point, though, Jim, doesn't it, that Labour is struggling to find a way of handling reform. And so they get themselves into this situation of thinking, well, if we go as extreme as they do, so, Farage has said some really extreme things in the past and seems to get away with it, that'll be fine. But I remember, I think we were probably doing the podcast. If not, we certainly had the conversation privately that Johnson said Jimmy Savile in the Commons and targeted Starmer with that particular slur. And his key advisor resigned because Johnson wouldn't apologise. So I think it is a mistake. I'm with you, Joe. I think Peter Kyle is one of the top performers and one of the most authentic of cabinet ministers. But he made a mistake. What's been disappointing for me is I didn't expect him to apologise for Farage. They never apologised to another politician. But equally, I didn't think there'd be this doubling down. And I think it was such a simple thing for them to actually handle and take the heat out of the conversation and say, well, this legislation has been now nearly 10 years in the making. We've got to press the button at some point. Let's keep it under review so that we can come back and see what the consequences are. But ultimately, if you want them to attack Farage on this issue, you basically say, here he is again, he's more interested in protecting the tech bros than he is in protecting children. That's a far more effective line than bringing up the spectre of Jimmy Savile.
Exactly.
Yeah. The the attack should have been more gentle. It would have been more effective, because the question should have been gently posed back to Farage. Well, what's reforms policy on this tide of? I mean, and let's just move the conversation on a little bit, because this is what's at the heart of it. This tide of porn, self-harm, suicide, which our youngsters can get access to. And of course, as you've mentioned, these VPNs can get around this 10 years of legislation. And now we find out that VPNs can get around the legislation. So we've got a big problem here with the tech companies, and there are all sorts of algorithms which actually encourage the more clicks you get on the porn, the more money they make through the advertising. I mean, the whole thing is, I mean, if you said you were going to allow people to put pornographic leaflets through everyone's letterbox, they'd be outraged. But that's where we are, and that's what needs to be addressed. But the attack on reform should have been far more nuanced, because I'd like to know what Mr. Farage, in the scales of free speech versus doing something about this odious material, where does he stand?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think where I'd like to see this debate move to, though, more so, is parental responsibility.
Exactly.
You've got to be able to get a grip of your kids' phones and see what they're on, and have honest conversations with your children to the point where they feel comfortable coming to you and saying, look what's popped up on my phone, Dad. Or in my case with our girls, Mum. But they do. And that's because you've got to have an awareness of the dangers that are about. And you've got to say to your kids, look, I'm not interested in the conversations you're having with your mates, but I do need to make sure that you're not being targeted by people from the dark web. You're not being targeted by strangers, by adults who are pretending to be other kids. But that's down to parents. And again, I'm not one of these people, of course. I'm not, that doesn't believe in state intervention where it's required. But surely the time has come. Both, again, we've gone back over this before, haven't we, in terms of the school curriculum, where there's better education for our children in our schools. This is seldom discussed, I can tell you, in the classroom, and where we've got to be saying to parents, you've got a responsibility here to make sure that your kids are protected from this stuff. And
we're in this, it's this. I mean, I've got granddaughters 6 and 9.
Yeah.
And the question is, and it won't be for me, but the challenge for parents, and I know what you're going to say, but I just want to make this point, that at the moment they are wonderful, innocent children, and you just wonder when they're going to have to go over that threshold and be given the information that you so rightly talk about. It's a very gentle process, but it's a bit depressing when you think now girls, the world isn't all wonderful. And boys, of course. Yeah. I've got to start talking to you about this, and you have that feeling. I don't want to bring the beginnings of the darkness into their lives, but I mean, we live with this stuff which seems to be uncontrollable by governments. I mean, I don't accept that it's uncontrollable if they really want to do something. But anyway, that I think is some of the parental reluctance.
And I think that's completely understandable, Jim, but I think that there is a bigger issue here, and I think Frank's absolutely right. It does need to be in schools and at homes, because I think sometimes parents, grandparents, and other people who have a part in children's life are not aware of just what's available. I mean, we would have to go looking for this. But I think something we are certainly aware of, and probably most people listening to this podcast are aware of, is fake news. And that's the way you start, actually. And if you can see, I mean, I don't know if any of you saw the story over the weekend of a woman who rented an Airbnb and then, left it after several months or something, and then got this bill for $12,000 with photographs of, wrecked furniture, broken mirrors, stained mattresses. And the whole thing was an AI fake, along with newscasts that if you only see 15 seconds of a clip and somebody looks as though they're in a studio and behind them it says news, and we're crossing now to Jim Hancock, our reporter, and there's Jim Hancock holding a microphone with news on it. And this is a BBC Verify thing, and it's really worth looking at. You have to stop and think, hang on, there's no organisation that's just called news, and everybody who's got a strap on the microphone says, whatever it is, whether it's Sky or BBC or whatever. So I think, we need to teach children how to spot what's real and how to ask questions, because that's the way they come to us or their teachers and say, is this real? In the same way as, we take them to a pantomime and we expect everyone to suspend disbelief as Peter Pan flies through the auditorium. In a way, we're having to say to them, and this isn't about breaking their innocence, it's about, well, you have to ask questions. Why do you think that's real? Or in the same way, you say, no, that bad fairy is not real. It's somebody dressed up. Look at their legs. Or, do you know what I mean? And in some ways, we need to start having that conversation that makes them more questioning of what they see, whether it's posing as news or whether it's posing as I want to be your friend and I'm only 12.
I think it's a huge issue, and obviously something that governments will inevitably feel that they have to tackle. But I think that you've got to do it in a far more diverse way than simply saying we're going to introduce this legislation and that's going to sort things out. And I think that given the fact it's taken 10 years or so to get to Parliament and to get assent, or presume it will get assent, and time's moved on. These tech companies have found ways of getting around these things. And again, the point that I think you've both made is kids are far more attuned to finding ways around this stuff now anyway. So it'll piss people like me off who are spending an extra 5 minutes trying to get onto accounts that I want to get onto. But for the kids, they'll be saying, oh, it's easy. I've got a shortcut here. I can sort that out. That's no problem at all, which is why I come back to the point, Chip. I think education of children and some parental guidance and control is crucially important here. And that's the only way in the end that we're really going to be able to tackle this. But yeah, big issue, and one that I'm sure we'll come back to in the future, right? We're going to take a short break. When we come back, we'll be talking Trump tariffs and Epstein. And we'll be looking at that appalling situation which continues to emerge in Gaza. So stay with us. We'll be back in a moment. Welcome back to the Downtown End Politics podcast with me, Frank McKenna, joined as ever by Jim Hancock and Joe Phillips. We're going to turn our attention to all things international now. And Donald Trump, of course, always in the news. What's he been up to this week? Well, tariffs, of course. He's done, I think, a good deal, he would say, as far as the negotiations with the European Union were concerned. So he slapped 15% tariffs on an awful lot of goods from the EU that are going to be going into the United States. He's put 35% tariffs on Canada. I think it might be the same or higher on Brazil. Lots of other things in terms of Trump and his tariff world have been going on. It's not been met with any great enthusiasm by the markets. The US economy will eventually be damaged by these moves, but I think that on the face of it, these negotiations, recent negotiations that have taken place, makes him look the winner, and that's all he cares about, because of course he's in his own little reality television show where it's the daily episode of Trump is saying, yeah, you've won this one, Donald. So Jim, these tariffs, I don't think the Germans and the French are too pleased with von der Leyen in terms of the deal that she did in Scotland, of course, which is where she went to do those negotiations with the president.
Yes, she has. She is coming under quite a lot of criticism for that. But obviously, we know about the antagonism between Donald Trump and the European Union. He doesn't like the institution. And so I'm not surprised that they've got 15% tariffs. And of course, the Canadian thing is partly linked to Canada's recognition or planned recognition of Palestine. The markets haven't overreacted to this. In a sense, we had this dramatic story in the spring, and he notified everyone that they were going to that August was the deadline. So there's been some level of anticipation that this would happen. And we'll see what happens to the American economy. I note what you say, that you think this is going to be bad for the American economy. But one of the benefits, as Trump would see it, is that a lot of these countries have, in return for a slight reduction in the tariffs, to invest heavily in the United States, to move some of their plants, some of their manufacturing to the United States. So, I mean, it may be that it actually acts as a benefit, but obviously there are increased costs for American consumers, and that, of course, the economy's stupid, the old phrase, that will be the issue that Trump will be judged on, so we'll have to see. We've sort of come to live in this world of tariffs. I think, to be fair to Keir Starmer, we've given quite a lot of stick on this podcast, but it looks as if his negotiation looks quite good in the light of what's happened with the European Union and Canada, etc. And but there's obviously still negotiations over steel going on. But we'll just have to see how it plays out. But at the moment, in terms of the economy, I think Trump is being seen to be successful. He's being seen to be successful on the Mexican border with immigration. The cloud on his horizon, of course, is this continuing Epstein story.
Yeah, and we'll come to that in a second. I mean, it's interesting, isn't it, Joe, that he's pushed the deadline back as far as the negotiations with China are concerned, or China, as Jim would say.
China. Yes, exactly. And I think the country that was absolutely stunned was Switzerland, which you very rarely hear in the news for anything at all. But they got something like 39% tariffs. I mean, the impact is, there was some figures out today, actually, showing that the people at the sort of the lowest end of the employment sector in America are beginning to see their wages hit, and the cost of living going up. And of course, the other impact of the tariffs around the world, which Trump doesn't give a damn about, is the very, very poor countries, particularly countries in Africa and South America, where they are exporting things, or they're treating material to make jeans, for instance, and stuff like that. And that's having a massive impact on them and their economies. So, at the same time as we see foreign aid being cut, not just by America, but by the British government as well, the countries that need help most are having their trade and their ability to stand on their own 2 feet also having a detrimental effect because of these tariffs. I mean, he's all over the place, isn't he? He's sending nuclear submarines, apparently, to Russia in response to the comments of a former president, which is a little bit like, Keir Starmer going to battle, or Kemi Badenoch going to battle with what Neil Kinnock says. I mean, it's absolutely bonkers. And again, it's all this sort of sleight of hand and lots of activity. So you're not going to talk about the one thing, the big elephant in the room, which is the thing that is really hanging over his head.
I think that, listening to economists, this is going to take some time to filter through to the US economy. And I think, to his base, as I say, this will look like success because the EU has bent the knee, 15% tariffs on their goods, not reciprocated. Canada, obviously, he and Carney absolutely don't get on, but we've not seen any retaliatory tariffs so far. I think that may change as far as the Canadian situation is concerned. But it is all about the optics for Trump, and he will be saying that this is a win. He'll be celebrating the fact. So we'll see the longer term impact of this, which, as I say, all economists suggest is going to have a detrimental impact, not just on America, but on the global economy. So we'll see. Let me read this paragraph from this week's Economist on his trials and tribulations with Mr. Epstein. So, the Republican leadership in America's House of Representatives sent the chamber into an early recess to avoid a vote on releasing documents relating to Jeffrey Epstein, a dead financier who trafficked underage girls for sex. A sense of crisis has gripped the White House, as normally loyal MAGA supporters of Donald Trump become incensed at the withholding of material on Epstein that may prove embarrassing to the president. Mr. Trump has said he wants transparency, and he is suing the Wall Street Journal and Rupert Murdoch, whose company owns the paper, for running a story that claims he wrote a bawdy note to Epstein in 2003, 3 years before the first criminal charges were laid. This story runs and runs, and I just think that was a nice little summary from The Economist, which is why I read it out. But it's not going away, Jim, and ordinarily he has been a master of deflecting. And I think the tariffs was part of that. Some of the other things that have happened this week, he's been trying to basically get people's attention drawn away from this story. But of course, he's hung on his own petard here, isn't he? Because he was the one, alongside some of his lieutenants, not least J.D. Vance, his vice president, who was saying this is a scandal. This is a paedophile ring. Lots of top Democrats are involved in this, and we're going to release all the documentation when we get into office. And of course, what he's found, subsequently we know this now, is that his name is writ large in many of the documents that have been found by the FBI and others.
Yeah. Yes, it was a big issue in the campaign. You know, that's what he wanted people to believe, that there was this conspiracy, and now it's become uncomfortable for him. I mean, it's slightly curious that they, you know, if he knew that he was going to be cited in these documents, that he made such a big issue of it, because inevitably it was going to come up. But I do think that the grassroots of the Republican Party, you know, this is really important to them, that there is this sort of conspiracy in Washington. The hated federal state is hiding things from them, and the powerful people controlling it, the big state, is always against the right. And that's a very powerful message, and it's very difficult for Trump to invite his supporters to stop looking at it. There is one issue about this full disclosure, as I understand it, although, you know, instinctively one's always in favor of full disclosure of these documents that have been sealed in the Florida case, I think it is. There are problems with, you know, putting it all out, not least that there could be identification of children, child pornography, stuff like that. So it's not quite as simple as that. But this is clearly something that isn't going to go away, and I don't see how it's going to be really resolved. I mean, the other interesting thing, of course, is that we've talked previously about one of the sinister features of the Trump administration has been the cowing of the media. But we have to give full credit to the Wall Street Journal, who sort of knew in advance what was going to happen, that the lawsuit would come in. I mean, Trump really does get down to the petty weeds sometimes. I understand the Wall Street Journal were denied credentials to cover Trump in Scotland as a result of this. I mean, it's sort of like you remember those old stories where football clubs used to ban journalists and they had to watch the match over a ladder. It gets down to that sort of pettiness. So he's clearly rattled by this, and you know, I mean, I suppose it's the old Alistair Campbell thing. You know, as long as the story keeps having legs and keeps going, then it will be important. But you know, in the absence of, if there's sort of a legal deadlock on it, it might just fade away, and you know, the economy improves, people will park it. But at the moment, it's a running sore.
Yeah, I don't think this is going to be the thing that brings him down, but I think it does chip away at his credibility. It certainly gives people like Vance an opportunity of saying we really don't need this guy in for like Trump 3.0, which is obviously on his agenda, because again, some of his lieutenants are already saying why they think the Constitution should be changed in order for Donald Trump to continue as president beyond this second term. So, as I say, Joe, I don't think it's going to bring him down, but it is embarrassing. And yeah, take account of everything that Jim said in terms of the difficulties and challenges of full disclosure. But of course, Donald Trump and these other characters who were saying they were going to give us full disclosure were well aware of those challenges. So it strikes people who are even supportive of Trump as rather strange, doesn't it?
Yes. And, you know, frankly, I think Trump might have met his match in Rupert Murdoch. You know, here we have two elderly men who are both wealthy beyond anybody else's wildest dreams. Murdoch doesn't give a shit. He will fight him. And his editor, who's a British woman, Emma Tucker, who went over and took over the Wall Street Journal and did a lot of very unpopular changes, but turned it round, and is now hugely respected. You know, she would not have run this story had she not got verification and was sure, because they knew a lawsuit was coming. So I think this could be his Watergate moment. I don't think it will bring him down, but I think, there are a couple of other things. One is that Ghislaine Maxwell has been moved to a lower security prison, which is probably the precursor to her being released on condition of then keep your mouth shut, love, and if you're lucky, I'll make you an ambassador somewhere, because that seems to be the trajectory for former jailbird mates of Trump. And the other thing is his firing of the person who is in charge of the bureau department that does the employment figures. I don't like them. You're fired. Well, you see, that's Rachel Reeves' answer. Just fire the entire Treasury.
Shoot the messenger.
It's ridiculous. It's a child.
Rachel might be looking at the Trump playbook and thinking that might be my only way out. It's fake news. It's fake news. Just quite incredible. I think the Ghislaine Maxwell point is well made as well, Joe, and you do wonder how that's going to play out. I think if they release her, you will get a huge outcry, not just from the MAGA base, but from the victims, who are often forgotten in this story because of all the political machinations. But of course, we're talking about hundreds of women who were victims of this scam. And ultimately, I think that if he did release her, then that might finish him off, actually, because people would, I think, then start to look at this story in a slightly different way. And I think also, isn't it strange that conspiracy theorists, again, often hung on their own petard, because the story that's going around on the web now is that this is how Trump was basically introduced to his missus. The First Lady, Melania. It was Epstein that introduced her. I don't think they're suggesting she was 14 when he introduced her to him, but nevertheless, there's that whiff of something not quite right. And, the First Lady is now being drawn into the story. And of course, the other thing that will be concerning Trump, great point you make about Rupert Murdoch, of course it is, Joe, and good to see the press finally standing up to this bully. But people like Joe Rogan, who big following, it's a big podcaster in the States, big supporter of MAGA. But he's saying, no, this isn't good enough. We want to see what's in those documents. And sorry, Mr. President, if that's going to be embarrassing to you, then so be it. But we want you to keep the pledge that you made during the election campaign, which was to release this stuff. So it's a story, as I say, that's not going away, despite his best efforts to deflect. And we'll see where it goes. I'm sure it's one we'll return to. But far more importantly, in the big scheme of things, and this appalling situation that continues in Gaza, more stories overnight of incidents that are happening there, and more civilians being killed. Of course, some Israeli hostages still being held by Hamas as well, following that appalling incident on October the 7th, 2 years ago. Is it 2? Is it 3? Lose track of time with these things. But the big news coming out of the UK was the announcement from Keir Starmer, who recalled his cabinet to say that the government would recognise a Palestinian state if, and there was a caveat, if the Israelis didn't meet particular demands by, I think he said, September. I think what Keir has managed to do here, Jim, is piss everyone off who's a supporter of the Israeli government and piss everyone off who's pro-Palestinian. So I'm not sure whether that means he's getting it about right, or whether, again, politically, he's not really read the runes.
Yeah, well, Kevin Johnson, Joe and I were discussing this last week, and we all agreed that this was, perhaps with the best of intentions, gesture politics writ large. I've taken some time in the last week since our conversation to actually look up some of the documents, and there are plenty of them about the two-state solution, because what this all goes to is recognition of Palestine, recognizing what? I mean, there have been some distinguished academics in the last week or two have said that in order for a state to be recognized, it has to have 3 or 4 key criteria, amongst them being recognized borders, that somebody speaks with one voice, etc., etc. Well, there aren't any defined borders. In fact, I've done some research on this, and if you look at the map of the West Bank, where 700,000 Israeli settlers now live, where they're living, it is an impossible jigsaw to try and draw borders around that without massive repatriation, and I don't think anybody's contemplating that. And of course, on the one voice thing, they don't speak with one voice. The Palestinian Authority speaks for the West Bank. Hamas still speak for Gaza. And just my last point is that this Israeli claim that Starmer and Canada and France have merely rewarded Hamas was up in bright letters at the weekend, because Hamas said they're not. They showed this grotesque picture of this Israeli hostage. They say they're not going to make peace. They clearly are encouraged by this recognition talk. And the response this morning of Israel is to want to escalate the military situation. So you're absolutely right. I'm afraid that to make this gesture, he was under severe pressure from within the Labour Party. Don't underestimate that. But it's causing a whole heap of trouble.
Joe?
Well, yes, I mean, as Jim was probably there, the Montevideo Conference in 1933, which outlined the rules for recognising a state, which is stable borders and stable government, which, as Jim has said, the Gaza has got neither of those. Palestine has got neither of those. And I don't quite understand the narrative that Keir Starmer used by saying recognition of Palestine was a threat, towards Israel, which is completely wrong, because what it ought to be about is recognising the people of Palestine and their right to self-determination and somewhere to live as part of us. But to hold it up as a threat to Netanyahu, who doesn't care, another old man who doesn't care about what people think. But I do think what's significant, and I think this has been slightly sort of eclipsed by everything else, is that the Arab states, for the first time in a long time, have all got together pretty much and have said, Hamas, you need to disarm. We need to have a proper government. We need to have something that creates a Palestinian statehood, because that's the only way we're ever going to get to peace. And I think that influence might play out. In the meantime, more children will die of starvation. More people will be shot trying to get desperately needed aid, and people will wring their hands. But I think, as far as the Labour Party is concerned, and in a way it goes back to what you were saying earlier, Frank, and have said before about inexperienced people becoming MPs, there has to be a point when you say to people, grow up. You can't just go, okay, we're going to recognise Palestine, right, so we'll go off on holiday now, we can ignore that. It's a bit like, click the thing, follow somebody, sign up to whatever it is, Me Too or some Twitter campaign. These things take time, they take effort, they take an enormous amount of back channel stuff. They've got Jonathan Powell, who was hugely influential and instrumental in the Good Friday Agreement. He's there, he knows what's going on in the Middle East. And I just think, there are times when Keir Starmer needs to say to his people, we're not in the sixth form or the student union now. We've got to do something that's meaningful, because otherwise it's completely meaningless.
Yeah. I think Blair said this, didn't he? Sometimes the best thing to do is nothing.
Yeah.
And in fact, it was Roland Keating who said, you say it best when you say nothing at all. Perhaps that's a line that needs to be used a bit more often from the government. I take that point, actually, Joe. It's a good one. They do seem to... I know what you're saying, Jim. He's under enormous pressure and all that sort of thing. But when has that not been the case as far as Palestine and Labour leadership is concerned? Because this isn't a new dispute.
Oh, no, but I mean, the continual sight of these children dying from hunger, I mean, that's what the additional...
I understand that. But equally, I think that sometimes you do have to say, well, as Joe's just referenced, in reality, and again, is this about being honest with people and talking human again? Whatever the fucking British government say ain't really going to make much of a difference. And what Starmer is saying, really, what Starmer will be thinking, really, is there is only one way in which Netanyahu is going to be brought to heel, and that's if Trump decides to go after him aggressively. So if I piss Trump off in the way that Macron and Carney and others have, then it's game over, because I then stop having influence of any sort over Trump. And, again, can you have that mature and honest conversation with people who are waving Palestinian flags all over the UK? No, you can't. So don't say anything. Basically say, look, it's a terrible situation. We're in negotiations with our international allies. We're doing our very best. But you've made the point, Jim. It just seemed like gesture politics.
Yeah, back the Arabs. Don't annoy Trump, and back the Arab states. Joe makes a powerful point. The Arab states starting to put pressure on Hamas. That's a really significant development. Don't drive the Arab states back again.
And the thing I'd say, just in terms of the situation as far as Israel is concerned, talk about damaging your brand. I don't think Israel is going to recover its international reputation for many, many, many years ahead. The scenes that have been broadcast, and this is from the pictures that we can see. Let's not forget the Israeli government have banned the BBC and other international news outlets from actually filming some of the horrific things that are clearly going on. And you see, when you start to exercise people like Joe's old boss, Bob Geldof, and other celebrities across the globe, don't underestimate the impact that has on, as I say, your brand, and the generational impact, negative impact this is going to have on Israel. I don't think should be underestimated. It has been an appalling execution of a conflict. No question that Israel had every right to defend itself and to respond to that awful situation that occurred, as I say, October the 7th, a couple of years ago. But to basically partake in what is genocide is inexcusable and ought to be condemned by the whole of the international community. And it is a shame that we don't have somebody in the White House who's a little bit more focused and a little bit more aware of the wider implications of this particular conflict. Let's not forget Trump's first response to this when he came into the White House was to see if he could build some sort of fucking resort in Gaza. Oh, yeah. He's never taken the issue as seriously as he should. And his envoy that was sent across last week for a flying visit doesn't appear to have taken things that seriously either. As I say, I think lots and lots of mates who are Jewish who are saying to me they just simply can't get their heads around how Netanyahu has been able to get away with this.
You have to conclude that Netanyahu actually does want to drive out. They want to drive. Yeah. They want to depopulate Gaza.
Yeah, of course he does.
And get the Arab states to accept the Palestinians into their countries, Jordan and Egypt. That has to be the conclusion, to make life so intolerable.
Which is pretty much what Russia is doing in Ukraine. I mean, it is absolutely unbelievable. And Keir Starmer, I think, could have said, there are things we can do. There are things that the European Union can do. First of all, it's not just the arms. We only sell a few, a handful. And we've already stopped that. But you stop the components that you sell. You stop doing trade with Israel. And if the whole of Europe stopped doing trade, whether it's on avocados or oranges or olive oil or whatever, you begin to have an impact, because that whole thing about making them a pariah state is saying to the people there, you need to get rid of Netanyahu because he's not doing you any good for all the reasons that you've just said, Frank.
Do you not think, though, Joe, that Starmer's main concern here will be trying to keep Trump on side? He was able to, during that brief visit to Scotland, get Trump to say for the first time, kids are starving and it's unacceptable. And I know it's a difficult balancing act, and I know that we'd all love to see the Love Actually moment where Starmer stood up to Trump and all the people who are saying it looks sycophantic and he looks like a bit of a poodle. But ultimately, Starmer, we know, is a technocrat who likes to think he can deliver things and get things done. And I think as much as what you're saying, Joe, I will fully support, my heart would tell me to do that. His head will be saying to himself, we just need to try and get the states to do a bit more on this issue.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. And I think, Starmer is treading a difficult balance between keeping Trump on board, but also keeping his party on board, because, feelings are running very, very deep. And this, of course, after the Corbyn Sultan or whatever they're going to call themselves, whether or not that does things. But that, of course, taps into people's, horror and shock. But yes, you're right. I mean, for Trump to actually say, this is not fake news. I mean, there is a certain irony coming out of the mouth of that man, but this is not fake news. These kids are starving. If only he'd said, so Mr. Netanyahu, open up to international broadcasters, whether it's ABC, CBC, BBC, or whoever it is. Let us see what's happening. I mean, that would have been very powerful. But I think, to get Trump to even go that far it allows people within his supporter group to say, this is awful, we can't see these kids starving. And I think that is the beginning. So I think Starmer's doing the best he can. But the awful thing is there is such an urgency about it because people are dying every minute.
Yeah, it has turned the opinion, Jim, of some of the MAGA movement. People who previously were foursquare behind Netanyahu and Israel are now saying this is unacceptable, the scenes that we're seeing from Gaza now.
Yes, I mean, but one senses, I get very depressed with these conversations because we're going round and round in circles, and people are dying, as you say. Just very briefly, the solution seems to me to be, I mean, obviously the United States should put more pressure on Israel, that's for sure. But this is a real challenge for the Arab states of the region, extremely wealthy, sometimes with divisions, we know, between Qatar and Saudi Arabia and all this sort of stuff. But this is a real challenge for Egypt in particular, and Saudi Arabia with its wealth, and Jordan, which is a good country, we've got good relations with them, to actually remove Hamas and then put in huge investment in Gaza, perhaps recognize Gaza as Palestine for the time being, because the West Bank is too problematic. So you have a Palestinian state in Gaza, but with the Arab countries guaranteeing security there, so that Israel is comforted that there are not going to be terrorist gangs setting up there, but an international Arab police force in Gaza, call it Palestine if you want. That would be a start, in my opinion.
Some good points well made there, James, to end that particular conversation. It's a really complex issue, as we know, and we always have to try and caveat our remarks when we're talking about this issue to ensure that we're being as balanced as we possibly can, and to make it clear that we are, as ever, as critical as anybody else about the activities of Hamas. And as I say, that attack on the 7th of October, keep repeating how appalling that was. But nevertheless, there is a over-the-top response that we need to refer to as far as Israel's concerned, and it would be wrong for us not to talk about that as well. I think we've covered an awful lot this week, chaps and chapesses. Thank you to Chris Wilcox, our producer, as ever, who has sat trying to keep us within the timescale set and has failed miserably, unfortunately. But we'll be back again next Monday. And before that, perhaps, I'll be in conversation with my old boss, the former leader of Lancashire County Council, Louise Ellman, who, of course, went on to become the MP for Riverside, Liverpool. And she's going to be coming into the den this week to have a chat with me. So listen out for that. Maybe published this week, possibly next, depending on how busy our producer Chris is. But it's been great to be back, guys. Lovely to see you again.
And you, Frank.
Sorry to hear about Plymouth's continued difficulties, James, but The
Well,
mighty
it's
Everton.
handy if you sign a striker, someone who's actually signed to put goals in the net. That's pretty much a basic priority, really.
Listen, everybody can say that.
It's early days. It's early days, Jim.
We had a magnificent 2-2 draw with Manchester United in some awful American competition last night. I stupidly stayed up until after midnight watching it. But there you go. Next week, of course, we will be preparing for the start of the new Premier League season. It'll only be a week away, so we may touch on what we think about the Premier League and how that's going. It'll be interesting to get your thoughts on that, because I think they may be in danger of shooting the golden goose the way they're carrying on with these fair play regulations and all the rest of it. But we'll get into that conversation next week. As I say, been great to be back. Good to see you both. And thanks for listening, everyone. We'll see you next Monday.